Picture this rolling vineyards bathed in golden sunlight, the scent of ripe grapes heavy in the air, and the quiet hum of a medieval village going about its day. But beneath this serene surface, a silent war was brewing, one fought not with swords but with barrels of wine and the subtle sway of influence. This is the untold story of the winemaker and the abbot, a silent rivalry that shaped a region, a clash of ambition and faith that would redefine an entire landscape. In a world where wine was more than just a drink, where it meant power, wealth, and even divine favor, two men found themselves locked in a battle neither could afford to lose. And the echoes of their struggle, they're still felt today. What makes this rivalry so extraordinary isn't just the stakes, it's the secrecy. No grand battles, no public confrontations. Instead, it played out in whispered deals, carefully timed harvests, and the unspoken tension between the earthy pragmatism of the winemaker and the spiritual authority of the abbot. One sought to control the land, the other the souls of those who worked it, and caught in the middle, a region whose very identity would be forged by their conflict. You might think of wine as a simple pleasure, but in this story, it's the key to understanding how politics, religion, and economics collided in the shadows of the medieval world. So why does this matter now? Because the legacy of this rivalry is written into the vineyards we admire, the traditions we celebrate, and even the way we think about wine itself. This isn't just history, it's a living testament to how hidden struggles can shape the world in ways no one expects. Over the course of this video, we'll peel back the layers of time to uncover how these two figures, one crafting wine, the other wielding faith, transformed a quiet corner of the world into a place of enduring significance. Get ready to step into their world where every barrel had a purpose and every sip carried the weight of ambition. The story begins now. To understand the stakes of this silent rivalry, we need to step into the village itself, a place caught between earth and heaven. Picture cobbled streets winding past clustered cottages, their walls stained purple from generations of grape crushing. Smoke curled from bakeries where bread was baked to sop up wine, while the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer mingled with distant monks chanting vespers. This wasn't just a village, it was a living chessboard. Every acre of vineyard, every barrel aging in cellars, every pilgrim stopping to pray at the monastery gates. They were all pieces in a game played by two men who knew the true value of this land. The winemaker's power came from the soil itself. His family had tended these vines for centuries, learning which slopes caught the sun just right, which grapes thrived after a dry summer, and how to turn humble fruit into liquid gold. Wine wasn't just a trade here, it was currency. A good harvest could buy alliances, settle debts, even sway local lords, but the abbot held a different kind of leverage. His monastery wasn't just a house of prayer, it was a fortress of influence. Pilgrims brought donations, kings sought blessings, and the church's word could make or break reputations. When the abbot spoke, people listened even if they preferred the winemaker's vintage. What made this village explosive was its place on the map. The road running through it wasn't just a dirt path, it was a lifeline connecting bustling markets to distant ports. Merchants hauling spices, wool, or salt would stop here, thirsty travelers with coin to spend. The winemaker saw them as customers, the abbot saw souls to save. And beneath it all, the land, that precious, fertile land. The monks needed it for tithes, the winemaker for his legacy. Neither could afford to lose ground, literally or figuratively. So they danced around each other, polite nods in the square, veiled threats in ledgers, each move calculated to keep the balance just tilted enough in their favor. This wasn't just a feud between two men. It was a collision of worlds, the earthy, tangible craft of the vineyard against the ethereal authority of the church. And the villagers, they were more than bystanders. A family might sell their grapes to the winemaker by day, then kneel before the abbot by night, torn between bread and blessings. The tension simmered in every harvest festival, every Sunday sermon, every barrel rolled onto a merchant's cart, because in the end, this village wasn't just growing grapes or saving souls. It was shaping history, one silent, stubborn standoff at a time. The winemaker's hands were stained purple, not just from grapes, but from the ink of contracts and ledgers. He knew every vine in his care like a father knows his children, which slopes yielded the boldest reds, which valleys sheltered the crispest whites, but his true genius lay in turning that knowledge into power. While monks prayed in the abbey's cloisters, he was busy courting merchants from distant cities, offering them not just wine but exclusivity. A barrel stamped with his mark became a status symbol, a token of taste that even the abbot's blessings couldn't match. What set him apart wasn't just skill, it was strategy. He played the long game, planting vines on disputed borderlands, knowing the church would hesitate to challenge a harvest already fermenting in barrels. When poor families struggled after a harsh winter, he'd extend loans not in coin but in cuttings from his prized vines. Soon their loyalty and their land quietly tilted his way. And when the abbot preached temperance, the winemaker hosted lavish feasts in the village square, letting the free-flowing wine do his talking for him. But his boldest move was one of silence. He never openly defied the abbey. Instead, he mastered the art of the unspoken challenge. If the monks demanded tithes in grain, he'd send his finest vintage instead, forcing them to choose between principle and pleasure. When pilgrims arrived, his workers just happened to be repairing the road near the monastery gates, with wine-soaked rags perfuming the air. Even his cellar was a calculated provocation, dug deep beneath the village, so that every winter the scent of aging oak and dark fruit would seep upward, a constant reminder of where true craftsmanship lay. The abbot might have held the keys to heaven, but the winemaker held the keys to something more immediate, the cellars where barrels aged like sleeping giants. His influence fermented slowly, year by year, until even the monastery's own cooks began serving his wine at feast days. It was a quiet revolution, one sip at a time. And though he never wore a crown, those who understood the alchemy of soil and sun knew the truth. This man didn't just make wine, he shaped destinies. The abbot's robes might have been woven from humble wool, but his influence was anything but modest. On the surface, he was a shepherd of souls, guiding his flock through prayer and penance. But peel back the layers, and you'd find a ruler as shrewd as any king. The monastery's walls didn't just enclose a place of worship, they guarded granaries bursting with tithed grain, cellars stocked with wine paid as tribute, and ledgers detailing the labor owed by every family in the village. His authority stretched beyond the spiritual. It was etched into the very soil where fields marked with the abbey's seal grew crops that fed both monks and their ambitions. Yet for all his power, the abbot faced a problem no amount of prayer could solve: the winemaker's quiet rebellion. Here was a man who owed no tithes to the church, whose wealth came not from ancient privileges but from the sweat of his brow and the cunning of his trade. When the abbot preached humility, the winemaker's barrels rolled past the monastery gates, their contents destined for the tables of merchants and minor nobles. It was a challenge wrapped in silence, a reminder that faith alone couldn't control a village whose heart beat to the rhythm of the harvest. So the abbot fought back, not with sermons but with strategy. He knew the winemaker's weakness wasn't in his vines but in the villagers who tended them. a well-timed blessing here, a reduced tithe there, small gestures that loosened loyalties. When the winemaker hosted feasts, the abbot opened the monastery's doors to the poor, offering bread and broth with a side of gentle persuasion. And then there were the taxes. The abbey's claim to a portion of every harvest was centuries old, but the abbot wielded it like a scalpel, exempting those who sided with him while letting the weight of tradition press down on others. But his masterstroke was subtler still. He began blessing the winemaker's barrels, not out of goodwill. No, this was a calculated move. By sprinkling holy water over the casks, he tied the wine's success to the church's favor, planting a seed in the minds of buyers. Even the finest vintage needed divine approval. It was a duel fought with symbols where every gesture carried layers of meaning. The abbot couldn't outlaw wine, but he could sanctify it, and in doing so, remind the village that no ambition, however bold, could thrive without heaven's tacit blessing. Yet for all his earthly power, the abbot's greatest weapon remained his role as the keeper of tradition. The winemaker might innovate, but the monastery held the past in its vaults, charters signed by long-dead kings, relics that drew pilgrims, and the unshakable belief that some things were sacred because they'd always been. In a world where time moved slowly, that was a force as potent as any vintage. The abbot didn't just rule, he embodied the weight of centuries, and that was a challenge no amount of clever contracts could overcome overnight. The battle lines were drawn not in the earth, but in the hearts and habits of the villagers, where faith and fermentation waged their silent war. The real brilliance of this rivalry lay in what wasn't said. The way a barrel placed just outside the monastery gates could speak louder than any insult, or how a carefully chosen scripture about humility might linger in the air after a particularly extravagant harvest festival. The winemaker understood that influence wasn't just about wealth, it was about spectacle. When he threw those feasts, they weren't mere celebrations. They were theater, long tables groaned under roasted meats and honeyed pastries, but the star was always the wine, endless pitchers of it, each pour a silent boast of his craft. And the guests, merchants who'd carry tales of his generosity to distant cities, laborers whose loyalty might hinge on a single night of plenty, even the abbot's own lay brothers, who'd return to the monastery with the scent of spiced wine still on their breath. For the abbot, the battleground was the pulpit. His sermons never named the winemaker directly, but everyone knew the meaning behind parables about the folly of earthly riches or the parable of the vineyard workers. A pointed pause when speaking of those who store up treasure on earth could cut deeper than any law, and when the winemaker's new cellar was blessed with unseasonably warm weather, the abbot didn't protest. He simply ordered a procession of monks to walk the fields with relics, praying aloud for temperate hearts and temperate skies. The message was clear, even nature answered to higher authority. Then there were the land disputes, fought not with swords but with parchment and precedent. A strip of rocky hillside might seem worthless until the winemaker planted drought-resistant vines there, only for the abbey to unearth an ancient charter claiming it as sacred ground. Trade restrictions became another weapon. The abbot couldn't ban wine, but he could remind pilgrims that true piety meant fasting before communion. Coincidentally, the same days merchants passed through town. Meanwhile, the winemaker's rumor mill whispered that the monastery's own cellars were stocked with his finest vintages, a quiet jab at the abbot's supposed austerity. What made this conflict so gripping was its restraint. Neither man could afford open war. The winemaker needed the abbey's pilgrims as customers. The abbot relied on the village tithes. So they danced around each other, their moves measured, their strikes veiled. A cancelled feast here, an unexpectedly generous almsgiving there. Even their victories were ambiguous. When the winemaker finally secured a contract to supply a noble's wedding, the abbot presided over the ceremony, ensuring his blessing was the last thing guests tasted before the wine. This wasn't just personal pride at stake. Their struggle mirrored the larger tensions of their era, the slow shift from a world where power flowed from altar and crown to one where skill and commerce could carve new paths. Every subtle maneuver, every unspoken challenge was a test of which force would shape the future, tradition or innovation, the weight of the past or the ferment of change. And the village, caught between them, became a living laboratory where the boundaries of power were quietly, relentlessly redrawn. Wine wasn't just a drink in this village, it was a currency of power, flowing through the region's veins like blood through the body. The winemaker understood this better than anyone. Every barrel he produced carried more than fermented grapes. It held the potential to sway loyalties, settle debts, and quietly undermine the abbey's grip on the village. When he lowered prices for local families during lean years, it wasn't charity. It was a calculated move to bind them to him, ensuring their labor and land would remain his when the abbot came calling for tithes. And when merchants arrived from distant cities, he'd offer them exclusivity contracts, tying their fortunes to his vineyards instead of the monastery's blessings. The abbot, however, was no stranger to this game. He recognized that wine could be both sacrament and weapon. By controlling when and how it flowed, he could dictate the rhythm of village life. During important feast days, he'd declare periods of fasting, drying up demand just as the winemaker's new vintages were ready to sell. When pilgrims flooded the roads, the abbot made sure the monastery's own cellars, stocked with wine given as pious donations, were the only place travelers could legally purchase a drink within miles. It was a masterstroke, turning the village thirst into a form of devotion, redirecting coin from the winemaker's pockets to the abbey's coffers. But the true battlefield was the harvest itself. The winemaker knew that the best grapes came from slopes the monastery claimed as holy ground. So he'd send workers to tend those vines under cover of dawn, their pruning knives slicing through the morning mist before the monks even stirred for prayers. The abbot retaliated by sending novices to bless the contested vineyards at noon, sprinkling holy water that, by ancient custom, made a tenth of the crop church property. It became a dance of shadows and sunlight, each man exploiting loopholes in tradition to claim what the other thought he owned. Even the weather became a pawn in their struggle. The winemaker kept detailed records of past harvests, using them to predict when early frosts might threaten the grapes. But the abbot controlled the village's only clock, the monastery bell, and could ring it late on chilly autumn nights, delaying workers from covering the vines until frost had done its damage. Conversely, when a heat wave threatened to overripen the crop, the abbot might suddenly call for a day of prayer and fasting, leaving the winemaker scrambling to find hands to harvest early. What made this conflict so fascinating was how ordinary villagers became unwitting players in the game. A family might wake to find their best vine cuttings stolen, only to discover the winemaker offering replacements from his private stock the next day. A barrel mysteriously spoiled during storage, the abbot's sermons that week would speak pointedly of God's judgment on greed. Every setback could be spun as divine will or human malice, depending on who told the tale. In the end, neither man could deliver a knockout blow. The winemaker's skill ensured his vintages were always in demand, but the abbot's authority meant no sale was ever truly free of the church's shadow. Their rivalry stretched decades, each adapting to the other's moves like vines twisting around an ancient trellis. And the village, it learned to thrive in the tension, absorbing the lessons of both men. That power could be pressed from grapes as surely as from prayer, and that even the quietest battles could reshape the land forever. The abbot's greatest strength wasn't just his title, it was his ability to turn faith into a language everyone understood. Picture the village square on a Sunday morning, packed with families in their best woolens, the air thick with incense as the abbot raised his hands. His sermons were never just about salvation, they were masterclasses in persuasion. A lesson about the parable of the talents could subtly remind farmers that their vines were God's gifts, and therefore the church's rightful share. A blessing over the harvest wasn't merely ritual, it was a public stamp of approval, a way to tie divine favor to the monastery's demands. Take the feast days, for example. These weren't just celebrations, they were carefully staged demonstrations of power. When the abbot processed through the streets with relics held high, villagers knelt not just in devotion, but in recognition of who controlled the calendar itself. A single feast day could mean the difference between a winemaker selling his new vintage or watching it gather dust in cellars while the village fasted. And pilgrimages, they were economic lifelines the abbot could tighten or loosen at will. By declaring a jubilee year, he'd flood the roads with thirsty travelers, then steer them to monastery-hosted inns where only church-approved wine was served. But the real genius lay in the sacraments. Confession became a way to gauge loyalties. A villager might admit to buying wine during Lent, only to find his penance lighter if he mentioned the winemaker's name. Marriages required the abbot's blessing, and suddenly, couples found their vows delayed unless they pledged a barrel from their wedding feast to the monastery. Even last rites held leverage families grieving a loved one might be gently reminded that burial in consecrated ground depended on good standing with the church. Yet the abbot's most potent weapon was the unspoken threat of exclusion. To be barred from communion wasn't just a spiritual stain, it meant becoming a social outcast overnight. Merchants would refuse to trade with the shunned, neighbors would cross the street to avoid them, and suddenly that vineyard on the hill found itself without workers at harvest time. The winemaker himself was too powerful to excommunicate outright, but the abbot didn't need to. A well-timed sermon about those who lead others astray could make his laborers think twice before accepting an extra cup at the harvest party. What made this so effective was its invisibility. There were no armed guards demanding tithes, no soldiers seizing land, just the quiet, relentless pressure of tradition. When the winemaker expanded his cellars, the abbot didn't protest. He simply sent monks to bless the construction site, turning the event into a church-sanctioned project. Resistance would have seemed like defiance of God himself. This was control woven into the fabric of daily life, so subtle that villagers often didn't realize they were being guided, only that straying from the path felt unthinkable. And so the dance continued. The winemaker might own the vineyards, but the abbot held the keys to something far more precious, the rituals that gave meaning to the villagers' lives. Every bowed head at Mass, every coin dropped in the alms box, every whispered confession reinforced the same message, that earthly pursuits, no matter how skillful, were fleeting without the church's blessing. The winemaker could age his vintages for decades, but the abbot dealt in eternity, and in a world where heaven felt as real as the soil underfoot, that was a rivalry no amount of barrels could ever truly balance. The winemaker knew he couldn't outpray the abbot, so he played a different game, one where generosity was his gospel, and the village itself became his congregation. When the monastery's bells called people to Mass, he'd be in the square handing out sacks of grain to families who'd had a poor harvest. While the abbot preached about heavenly rewards, the winemaker funded raucous festivals where the wine flowed freely and musicians played into the night. These weren't just parties, they were carefully staged displays of earthly joy, a reminder that life could be celebrated without penance or permission. His most cunning move was the chapel, not grand enough to challenge the monastery, but large enough to matter, a simple stone building at a crossroads where travelers could pause to pray. He stocked it with candles paid for by his own coin and hired a wandering friar to tend it. The abbot couldn't object without seeming petty, but the message was clear. Spiritual comfort no longer required a journey up the hill to the abbey's gates. Even the chapel's location was a calculated choice, standing where the winemaker's wagons rolled past on their way to market, ensuring every merchant who stopped to bless their journey also saw his family's crest carved above the door. Then came the roads, where the monastery's pilgrims trudged along muddy paths. The winemaker paid to have the main trade route paved with smooth, flat stones, making it easier for his barrels to reach distant towns. But he made sure the workers started their task near the village well, where everyone would notice. Soon, locals were calling it the Winemaker's Road, though it served the whole region. Even the abbot's own supply carts rumbled over those stones, a daily irony that must have stung. But his masterstroke was patronage of the arts. The monastery had its choir, so the winemaker commissioned a group of minstrels to sing ballads about the harvest songs that just happened to mention his vineyards by name. When the abbot's scribes painstakingly copied biblical texts, the winemaker paid for a lavishly illustrated almanac of grape-growing tips, ensuring his name appeared beside every full moon and planting date. Even the village children weren't overlooked. He sponsored a school where they learned their letters by counting wine barrels and measuring vineyard plots. The brilliance of his strategy lay in its deniability. Every act could be framed as public service, yet each one eroded the monastery's grip on daily life. The abbot might control the afterlife, but the winemaker was reshaping the here and now, one repaired roof or filled stomach at a time. And with every loaf of bread handed out during lean winters, every festival that made the village the envy of neighboring towns, the unspoken question grew louder. Who truly cared for the people, the man who promised salvation, or the one who put wine in their cups and coins in their pockets? This was more than charity, it was a quiet revolution. The winemaker couldn't claim divine authority, so he built something just as powerful, a legacy of tangible goodwill that no amount of heavenly rhetoric could undo. The villagers might still cross themselves when the abbey bells rang, but they raised their glasses to the man who made sure those bells weren't the only sound shaping their lives. And in that space between prayer and practical kindness, the balance of power began, ever so slightly, to tilt. The abbot's tithes were more than a religious duty, they were the teeth of an economic trap. Every barrel sold within 20 miles of the monastery owed a tenth of its value to the church, a rule as old as the abbey's foundations, but the winemaker had spent his life studying loopholes. When the abbot's assessors came to count his barrels, they'd find only half the true number lined up for inspection, the rest hidden in plain sight, stacked in the cellars of loyal families, labeled as vinegar in merchant caravans, even floated down river at night in hollowed-out logs. For every coin the abbot demanded, the winemaker devised 3 ways to keep it. Trade routes became battlegrounds. The abbot persuaded local lords to impose tolls on wine shipments passing through monastery lands, claiming the fees funded road repairs. The winemaker responded by forging alternate paths, paying farmers to let his carts cut through their fields, bribing ferrymen to ignore after-dark crossings. When the abbot pressured innkeepers to serve only church-blessed wine, the winemaker supplied them secretly, his barrels stamped with counterfeit monastery seals. It was a cat-and-mouse game where every move risked exposure, yet neither side could afford to escalate to outright confrontation. The real genius of this economic war lay in its indirect strikes. The abbot couldn't arrest the winemaker for underreporting yields, not without turning the village against him, so he targeted the supply chain instead. Coopers who made the winemaker's barrels suddenly found themselves paying higher tariffs on imported oak. grape pickers were reminded that working on feast days without the abbot's dispensation was a sin. Even the weather became a weapon, monks accidentally ringing the bells late during frost warnings, leaving vines unprotected. But the winemaker fought back with alliances. He courted minor nobles hungry for a taste of his prestige vintages, offering exclusive access in exchange for lowered tolls on his trade routes. When the abbot declared a new fast day to curb wine sales, the winemaker hosted a medical tasting for the local midwife and herbalist, who promptly declared his vintage vital for digestion, creating a loophole for health exemptions. The most bitter clashes happened in the marketplace. The abbot's monks would set up stalls beside the winemakers, selling sacramental wine at cut-rate prices to undercut him. The winemaker retaliated by hiring town criers to praise his vintages as fit for kings, while whispering that the abbey's wine was diluted with water. Neither accusation was entirely true, but in a village where reputation was currency, perception mattered more than ledgers. What made this struggle so fascinating was how it mirrored larger shifts in medieval society. The abbot represented the old order power flowing down from church and crown, enforced by tradition and fear. The winemaker embodied something new, a world where skill and commerce could challenge inherited authority. Every barrel smuggled, every toll avoided, was a tiny crack in the feudal system. And though neither man would have framed it that way, their rivalry was rewriting the rules of who controlled wealth and who had the right to profit from the land's bounty. The nobles of the region weren't just spectators in this silent war, they were the prize. Like pieces on a chessboard, their loyalties could tip the balance between vineyard and vestry. Take Count Reynard, a minor lord whose lands bordered both the winemaker's best slopes and the abbey's prized orchards. Every autumn, his hall became a battleground of competing gifts. Casks of the winemaker's rarest vintage delivered at dawn, followed by the abbot's messengers bearing relics for blessing his harvest. The count's decision wasn't just about preference, it was political calculus. Backed the abbot, and he secured his family's place in the afterlife. Side with the winemaker, and his cellars and coffers would overflow. For younger nobles, the choice was particularly fraught. Baroness Allais, newly widowed and desperate to prove herself, found the winemaker's offer impossible to refuse. He'd fund the repair of her crumbling bridge in exchange for toll-free passage of his barrels. But when the abbot caught wind of the deal, he sent his most eloquent friar to remind her that her late husband's soul still depended on the monastery's prayers. Torn between earthly survival and eternal peace, she compromised, allowing the winemaker's carts to pass by night while publicly donating a stained glass window to the abbey. The real power lay in the subtleties. A noble who openly defied the church risked rebellion among pious peasants, yet one who ignored the winemaker's influence might face quiet sabotage, barrels lost on their way to his table, or laborers too hungover after harvest festivals to tend his fields. Some, like the shrewd Viscount Guy, played both sides masterfully. He hosted the abbot for lavish Lenten feasts where no wine was served, then secretly purchased the winemaker's entire spring vintage at a discount, knowing the monastery's fasts would soon end and demand would spike. But the nobles' greatest value wasn't their land or gold, it was their legitimacy. When the winemaker needed to challenge the abbey's ancient land claims, it was Duke Henry who unearthed dusty parchments proving his ancestors had granted those very slopes to grape growers long before the monastery existed. And when the abbot retaliated by threatening excommunication, it was Henry's wife who calmed the storm by commissioning a chapel fresco featuring the winemaker's daughter as a modest grape-picking saint. In the end, the nobles weren't pawns at all, they were the game itself. Every tilted head during the abbot's sermons, every covert toast raised to the winemaker's health at banquets, reshaped the region's delicate balance of power. Their choices echoed far beyond their halls, proving that in this quiet struggle, even the smallest nod of a noble's head could ripple through vineyards and cloisters alike like wind through ripe wheat. The monastery's walls weren't just stone and mortar, they were a declaration. As the winemaker's influence spread, the abbot responded by raising towers that loomed over the village like stern fingers pointing heavenward. Every new chapel, every fortified gate was a reminder spiritual authority could still dwarf earthly ambition. The abbey's cloisters expanded outward, their arched walkways enclosing gardens where medicinal herbs grew, a quiet boast of the monastery's self-sufficiency. Even the bell tower gained a second tier, its bronze voice now loud enough to reach the farthest vineyards, as if to say no acre of land lay beyond the church's reach. But the winemaker's estate spoke a different language. Where the abbey soared upward, his power spread horizontally, a sprawling complex of cellars dug deep into the hillside, their vaulted ceilings cool and dark as a cathedral's crypt. Above them rose a manor house with windows positioned just so, catching the morning sun to illuminate casks being rolled to market. The courtyard wasn't paved with humble cobblestones, but with slabs of imported marble arranged in a pattern resembling grape clusters, a detail too subtle for the abbot to protest, yet unmistakable to anyone who noticed. Even their building materials whispered rivalry. The monastery used local limestone, its rough-hewn blocks symbolizing pious simplicity. The winemaker's masons, however, sought out creamy sandstone from quarries a week's journey away, its golden hue deepening in sunlight like a fine vintage. When the abbot commissioned a new fresco of the Last Supper for the refectory, with monks depicted as the apostles, the winemaker responded with stained glass windows in his hall showing biblical feasts where water famously turned to wine. The village itself became a canvas for their competition. The abbey funded a covered market near its gates, its roof beams carved with scenes of divine punishment for greed. The winemaker paid to widen the road leading to his estate, lining it with poplar trees whose leaves turned the color of aged white wine each autumn. Public fountains became particularly contentious. The monasteries bore inscriptions about temperance, while the winemaker's jet of water arced into a basin shaped like a tipped-over goblet, a playful jab that drew chuckles from villagers filling their buckets. What makes these structures so fascinating isn't just their beauty, it's their coded messages. The abbey's granary, built taller than any secular building, subtly reinforced that bread both earthly and spiritual came from the church. The winemaker's new press house, though, featured an innovation, a mechanical press powered by water from the same stream that turned the monastery's mill wheel. For those who understood, it was a cheeky reminder that tradition could be outpaced by ingenuity. Even now, centuries later, the village layout tells their story. Streets curve to avoid the monastery's land, then suddenly straighten near the winemaker's estate. A pilgrim's hostel stands abandoned near the abbey gates, its roof collapsed while the winemaker's guest quarters still welcome tourists, their walls hung with antique maps of vanished vineyards. These buildings aren't relics, they're the frozen echoes of a duel fought without swords, where every cornerstone laid was a gambit and every finished roof a victory. The stones remember what the records omit, that architecture was never just about shelter, it was about legacy, and in this quiet corner of the world, two very different legacies still stand shoulder to shoulder, their silent conversation etched into the landscape itself. Festivals in the village weren't just celebrations, they were high-stakes performances where every detail carried weight. When the abbot led the Corpus Christi procession through the cobbled streets, it wasn't merely a display of piety. The route itself was a map of power, winding past the homes of influential families first, the scent of incense lingering longest where loyalty was shakiest. Monks carried reliquaries heavy with saints' bones, their slow pace forcing the crowd to dwell on the church's ancient authority. Even the timing was strategic. The procession always began at the exact hour the winemaker traditionally opened his cellars for tasting, forcing villagers to choose between devotion and indulgence. But the winemaker knew how to turn spectacle to his advantage. His harvest feast was the anti-procession, a riot of color and noise that spilled across the village square. Where the abbot's event demanded bowed heads, his encouraged raised glasses. Musicians played tunes too lively for church grounds, and the wine flowed freely, served not in humble wooden cups but in glazed earthenware stamped with his family crest. The genius of these feasts lay in their generosity. A villager might owe the monastery tithes, but they'd remember whose wine warmed them during the first frost. Even the food carried symbolism: roasted pork instead of fish, spiced cakes instead of fasting bread, a deliberate contrast to the abbey's ascetic ideals. The abbot retaliated with theatrical piety. When the winemaker's feast coincided with a minor saint's day, he'd stage a miracle play right in the marketplace, complete with a heaven-sent rain of rose petals, conveniently showering the crowd just as the winemaker's servers began pouring. Pilgrims arriving for the feast would find themselves swept into a dramatic retelling of the wedding at Cana, with emphasis on how Jesus turned water to wine, not the other way around. What made these events so potent was their unspoken subtext. The winemaker's feast tables groaned under food grown on lands the abbey claimed as tithe-exempt, a quiet defiance of church authority. The abbot's processions, meanwhile, always paused longest near the winemaker's estate, as if blessing or surveilling the property. Villagers became adept at reading these cues. A family might send their eldest to the procession while younger siblings sneaked off to the feast, hedging their bets between heaven and earthly pleasure. Even the children's games reflected the divide. The monastery sponsored sack races and pious recitation contests, rewarding winners with wooden crosses. The winemaker hired jugglers and set up grape stomping competitions, the victors taking home small casks of new wine, a prize that inevitably made its way into parents' hands. These weren't just entertainments, they were early lessons in allegiance, shaping loyalties before children could grasp the politics behind the revelry. The true masterpiece of this theater was its deniability. Neither man could accuse the other of sabotage without seeming petty. When the winemaker's musicians accidentally played louder during Vespers, he'd blame the acoustics of the square. When the abbot scheduled a sunrise service the morning after the feast, he'd cite ancient tradition, not the hungover villagers groaning in the pews. Every move was couched in plausible innocence, turning the village calendar into a chessboard where holy days and harvest dates were pieces to be maneuvered. Yet for all their rivalry, these events bound the village together in unexpected ways. The abbot's processions gave structure to the year, while the winemaker's feasts provided release. Villagers might whisper about the tension between the two men, but they also relied on it, the push and pull between sacred and secular, creating a balance that kept life vibrant. In the end, the festivals weren't just battlegrounds, they were the loom on which the village wove its identity, thread by colorful thread. And though neither the abbot nor the winemaker would admit it, their competition made each celebration richer, as if the very air of the village had been spiced by their silent rivalry. In a village where trust was as precious as gold, rumors became the invisible knives that could slit reputations without leaving a trace. The winemaker knew this all too well. When whispers began circulating that his finest barrels had been blessed by a renegade priest implying his wine carried the taint of schism, he didn't panic. He simply hosted a public tasting where the local bishop, after 3 generous cups, declared the vintage a gift from God's own vineyard. But the abbot, ever the strategist, had already seeded his own story, that the bishop's sudden visit had been prompted by anonymous concerns about unholy fermentations. The truth hardly mattered. What stuck was the lingering doubt, the sideways glance from a neighbor, the pilgrim who now hesitated before buying a cask. Scandal flowed both ways. A well-timed rumor about the monastery's cellar master skimming profits could send the abbot scrambling to account for every drop of sacramental wine. The winemaker's allies might murmur that the abbey's tithes were funding not pious works, but the abbot's nephew's lavish education in Paris. Never stated outright, of course, just a merchant casually wondering aloud why the monastery's new stained glass bore the same colors as a certain noble family's coat of arms. These stories spread like tendrils of smoke, impossible to grasp yet staining everything they touched. The real artistry lay in plausible deniability. When a drunken cooper swore he'd seen the winemaker's workers dumping spoiled wine into the abbey's well, the source of the tale was always 3 steps removed, a cousin's neighbor's sister who'd heard it from a traveler. By the time the abbot had to publicly deny that his monks were falling ill from tainted water, the damage was done. Villagers began drawing their buckets from the winemaker's new fountain instead, its spout carved into the shape of a laughing Bacchus. Gossip's power came from its flexibility. A story could mutate by sundown. What began as speculation about the abbot's gout becoming worse after feasts might evolve into whispers that he demanded medicinal wines from the very vineyards he publicly scorned. The winemaker countered with tales of miraculous vintages, a blind woman regaining her sight after tasting his new press, a stillborn vine reviving when touched by his cloak. These weren't just boasts, they were carefully crafted legends that blurred the line between skill and divine favor, stealing a page straight from the monastery's playbook. Even children's rhymes became weapons. A skipping song about the abbot's fat cat stealing cream seemed harmless until everyone noticed the cat was the same color as the winemaker's prized grapes. The abbot retaliated by having choir boys sing hymns about the sin of envy during vintage season, their pure voices carrying across the slopes where pickers worked. What made this shadow war so effective was its intimacy. In a community where everyone knew each other's grandparents and grandchildren, rumors didn't just damage reputations, they fractured generations of trust. A family that had supplied the monastery with wool for a century might suddenly find their contracts reduced after someone remembered their great-uncle once sold mutton to the winemaker's grandfather. The past became as malleable as the present, and both men wielded it with the precision of master vintners blending their barrels. Yet for all its destructiveness, this battle of whispers had an unintended consequence. Villagers grew shrewd at reading between the lines, detecting manipulation where their ancestors might have seen only truth. The miller's wife might loudly praise the abbot's latest sermon on honesty while winking at her neighbor, a silent acknowledgement that in this village even virtue could be performance. The winemaker's rumors forced the abbey to be more transparent. The abbot's scandals made the vineyard's accounts impeccably precise. Like 2 rival blacksmiths hammering the same piece of iron, their conflict forged a community that learned, out of sheer necessity, to question everything except perhaps the wine itself. While the winemaker and the abbot dominated the chronicles of this rivalry, the quietest yet most potent players were often the women who moved through its shadows. Picture the winemaker's wife hosting feast days where monks and merchants sat elbow to elbow, her pouring hand ensuring no cup stayed empty long enough for tempers to flare. Or the abbot's sister, a nun who'd slip into the village with baskets of remedies, her healing touch opening doors closed to the monastery's formal emissaries. These women weren't mere bystanders, they were the invisible threads holding the fabric of the village together, mending tears before they could unravel into open conflict. Take Marguerite, the winemaker's sharp-witted daughter, who turned her embroidery circle into a diplomatic salon. While stitching grapevines onto linens, she'd casually mention how her father's new vintage paired perfectly with the abbey's honey, a subtle nudge toward collaboration. Or Sister Clotilda, the monastery's herbalist, who treated the winemaker's gout with poultices and patience, softening his stance toward the abbot between doses. Even the village midwife played her part, delivering babies in both the winemaker's household and the abbey's lay sisters' quarters, her gossip a currency that flowed both ways. Their power lay in what they weren't expected to do. When the abbot's tithe collectors clashed with vineyard workers, it was the winemaker's wife who invited both sides to her kitchen, diffusing tensions with ale and apple tarts. No contracts were signed at her table, but the next morning the collectors forgot to measure 3 rows of vines, and the workers stopped hiding the best grapes. Similarly, when the abbot's niece, a bookish novice, translated an ancient text proving the monastery's claim to a disputed field, she lost the parchment long enough for the winemaker to harvest his crop unchallenged. But don't mistake their gentleness for weakness. These women could stir the pot as deftly as they smoothed its contents. The winemaker's daughter might let slip that the abbot's favorite vintage came from vines the monastery once condemned as too worldly. A nun tending the sick could remind a feverish merchant that his debt to the winemaker paled beside the eternal consequences of cheating the church. Even the quietest gestures carried weight. A well-timed gift of spiced wine to the abbot's housekeeper, or a basket of monastery-blessed bread sent to the winemaker's ailing mother. The true brilliance of their influence was its invisibility. Men wrote the chronicles so their deeds filled the pages, but the women wrote between the lines. When a truce held, it was often because daughters had married across faction lines, weaving kinship where ledgers showed only competition. When violence threatened, it was a shared laugh over laundry day or a conspiratorial glance at market that reminded both sides how much they stood to lose. And perhaps most tellingly, when the rivalry finally eased, not with a grand treaty, but with the winemaker's grandson studying under the abbot's favorite scholar, few remarked on how the boy's mother had been the scholar's star pupil years before. The women of this village understood what the men often forgot, that the fiercest battles aren't won with barrels or blessings, but with the quiet, daily work of making conflict unthinkable. Their legacy wasn't recorded in ink, but in the way the village learned to breathe again, one mended fence, one shared recipe, one healed grudge at a time. Harvest season transformed the village into a pressure cooker, where the sweet scent of crushed grapes mingled with the sharp tang of fraying tempers. As workers flooded the slopes from dawn till dusk, their baskets brimming with fruit, every decision carried weight: which fields to pick first, which grapes to reserve for the finest vintages, who got paid in coin versus who settled for a share of the harvest. The winemaker needed every hand he could get, but the abbot demanded laborers for the monastery's own orchards and granaries. Families found themselves torn, their allegiances tested with each passing hour of sunlight. The real flashpoints were the borders, those strips of land where vineyard met monastery property. A row of vines stretching a few feet too far onto sacred soil could spark a shouting match between the winemaker's foreman and the abbot's bailiff. Workers caught in the middle learned to step carefully, knowing a misplaced foot might mean losing a day's wages or worse, being denied absolution at Sunday Mass. Some mornings, villagers would arrive to find boundary stones mysteriously moved overnight, the winemaker's men claiming erosion while the abbot's scribes produced parchments with faded ink insisting otherwise. Payment disputes turned simmering tensions into open flames. When the winemaker offered double wages to those who skipped the monastery's harvest festival, the abbot retaliated by announcing that tithes would be collected early, in grapes, not coin, leaving families with nothing to sell back to the winemaker. Tempers flared in the marketplace, where a barrel accidentally rolled into a monk's path could lead to a week of sermons about respect for holy men. Even the weather became a weapon. A sudden rainstorm might ruin grapes left unpicked, and rumors would swirl about who'd bribed the bell ringer to delay the alarm. Yet for all the drama, harvest also revealed the village's strange interdependence. The winemaker needed the abbot's pilgrims to buy his wares. The abbot relied on the winemaker's success to justify the monastery's tithe. Some years, when storms threatened the crop, they'd call an uneasy truce, monks and vineyard workers side by side in the mud, racing to save the harvest. Those nights, the wine flowed freely in the square, and even the abbot's steward might be seen nursing a cup, his rigid posture softening as the village remembered, briefly, what bound them together. But dawn always brought back the reckoning. The winemaker's ledger books lay open, calculating profits against losses, while the abbot's scribes tallied souls saved versus souls swayed by earthly temptations. The barrels rolled out, the tithes were collected, and the village exhaled until next autumn, when the grapes ripened again, and the silent war resumed with all the fervor of a vintage left too long in the cask. The year the rains refused to come began like any other bud swelling on the vines, monks chanting prayers for a bountiful season. But by midsummer, the cracks in the earth gaped like thirsty mouths, and leaves curled inward like clenched fists. The winemaker paced his parched slopes, calculating how many barrels he could salvage from the shriveled grapes. The abbot, meanwhile, watched his granaries empty as villagers who'd once donated grain now begged for scraps. Both men knew the truth. This wasn't just a poor harvest, it was a disaster that could unravel decades of careful power building. Then came the fire. Whether sparked by a lightning strike or a careless pilgrim's torch, no one could say. Flames raced through tinder-dry vineyards and licked at the monastery's outer buildings, forcing monks and vineyard workers to form a frantic bucket line side by side. In the choking smoke, distinctions blurred. The winemaker's son hauled water alongside novices. The abbot's steward shouted orders to men who'd dodged his tithe collectors weeks before. By dawn, the damage was stark. A third of the winemaker's oldest vines reduced to ash, the abbey's prized scriptorium saved only by a wall of soaked tapestries held by vineyard hands. What happened next would have been unthinkable in normal times. The winemaker appeared at the monastery gates not with a legal challenge or a barrel of vintage, but with a wagon load of sanded oak. "For your beams," he muttered, avoiding the abbot's gaze. The abbot, in turn, sent his master brewer to the scorched vineyards with casks of blessed water and a parchment listing which surviving vines had once belonged to the monastery's medieval founders. Not a claim, but a gift, their most resilient rootstock suddenly rediscovered in the archives. The real turning point came at the village well. With winter looming and tensions simmering over dwindling supplies, the winemaker did something unprecedented. He tapped his private reserve, not for merchants or nobles, but for the villagers themselves. Barrels appeared in the square alongside the abbot's alms bread. The two offerings placed just close enough to suggest coordination without either man having to admit it. Pilgrims whispered that the wine tasted sweeter that year, as if hardship had mellowed its bitterness. For all their rivalry, the crisis exposed their shared vulnerability. The winemaker's wealth meant nothing without healthy workers to tend his vines. The abbot's authority crumbled if his flock starved. Their grudging cooperation became a masterclass in realpolitik. The abbot temporarily waived tithes on the surviving grapes, while the winemaker quietly funded repairs to the monastery's charred guesthouse, ensuring pilgrims would still flock to town. Yet the most telling detail was one few noticed. When the Duke's tax collectors arrived that autumn, they found the winemaker's ledgers and the abbey's account books suspiciously aligned, both showing losses just substantial enough to qualify for royal relief. No one could prove the two men had met to coordinate their numbers, but the villagers chuckled into their cups, marveling at how quickly old enemies could unite when facing a common threat. The fire had burned away pretenses, leaving behind something far more potent, the reluctant acknowledgement that their fates were, and always had been, intertwined. The truce between the winemaker and the abbot wasn't signed in ink or sealed with a handshake. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, stitch by subtle stitch. One autumn morning, villagers noticed something peculiar. The winemaker's workers pruning vines right up to the monastery's boundary stone, but no farther. That same week, the abbot's sermon stopped mentioning those who hoard earthly treasures, though his eyes still flickered toward the vineyard during prayers. These weren't concessions so much as silent acknowledgments, each man recognizing the other's domain without ever admitting defeat. The winemaker's newfound autonomy showed in small rebellions that no longer needed to be rebellions at all. He built a public tasting room just beyond the abbey's jurisdiction, its walls painted with murals of grape clusters so lush they seemed to drip. The abbot, in turn, stopped sending monks to bless the barrels, but began including the winemaker's family in the annual procession of local benefactors, their names read aloud beside those of pious widows and charitable bakers. It was a trade dressed as tradition. The winemaker kept his profits, the abbot kept his pride, and the village kept its peace. What made this détente remarkable was its flexibility. When drought struck, the winemaker donated a cartload of reserve barrels to the monastery's cellar. Coincidentally, the same week, the abbot relaxed tithes for grape growers. When a noble visitor demanded to know why the region's wine tasted superior, the abbot praised the soil's God-given qualities while the winemaker toasted the monk's prayers. Their rivalry hadn't ended. It had simply grown too intricate to sustain open conflict. Like two old trees whose roots had tangled underground, they learned to share the same earth without choking each other's growth. Even their clashes became ritualized. The annual debate over harvest dates, once a source of venom, turned into a kind of theater. The winemaker would publicly demand an early picking. The abbot would insist on waiting for a feast day, and after just enough argument to save face, they'd settle on the exact midpoint both had privately intended all along. Villagers placed bets on how long the performance would last, treating it like a seasonal sport rather than a power struggle. The true proof of their unspoken pact lay in the land itself. Vineyards once contested now bore hybrid names: the Monk's Slope for a hillside the abbot had ceded, the Vintner's Chapel for a roadside shrine the winemaker maintained. Children born to vineyard workers were baptized with wine from casks the abbot had secretly approved. Monastery feasts served vintages the winemaker had ostensibly refused to sell. Their compromise became the village's inheritance, a lesson that even the bitterest rivalries could ferment into something richer given time. Neither man ever spoke of reconciliation. But when the winemaker's grandson enrolled in the monastery school and the abbot's nephew took an apprenticeship in the cellars, their shared glances held something beyond resignation. It was the quiet satisfaction of players who'd fought to a draw and found, to their surprise, that the game was better when neither side had everything to lose. The rivalry between the winemaker and the abbot didn't just fade into history, it fermented into the very identity of the region, leaving a legacy as complex and layered as the finest vintage. Walk through the village today and you'll see their fingerprints everywhere, in the way the local festival blends grape stomping with solemn processions, in the market stalls where monks still sell honey beside barrels of secular wine, even in the landscape itself, where vineyards and church spires share the same horizon. This wasn't just coexistence, it was alchemy. The winemaker's relentless drive for excellence and the abbot's devotion to tradition didn't cancel each other out. They fused, creating a culture where earthly pleasures and spiritual depth weren't at odds, but two sides of the same coin. Take the wine trade. Before the rivalry, the region's vintages were little more than peasant fare, rough, unremarkable, and drunk young. But the winemaker's competition with the abbey forced innovation. He experimented with aging techniques to outshine the monastery's blessed vintages, while the abbot's demand for sacramental wine pushed growers to cultivate more refined grapes. The result, a reputation for quality that turned the region into a destination for merchants from as far as Flanders and Burgundy. Even now, the local wine guild seal bears a curious hybrid symbol, a cluster of grapes entwined with a cross, a silent nod to the duel that elevated their craft. Yet the monastery's influence endured just as powerfully. The abbey became more than a spiritual center. It was a guardian of knowledge, its scriptorium preserving not just religious texts but agricultural wisdom. Monks meticulously recorded weather patterns, soil conditions, and harvest yields date the winemaker's descendants would later mine to perfect their vintages. Pilgrims still flock to the region, but not just for miracles. They come for the abbey's famed library, where illuminated manuscripts of psalms sit beside treatises on vine grafting, a testament to how sacred and secular learning grew intertwined. The most telling legacy, though, lies in the people. Generations later, villagers still joke that every family has one foot in the vineyard and one in the pew. It's not uncommon to see a winemaker pause mid-harvest to touch the relic of a local saint kept in the field chapel, or a monk casually recommending which vintage pairs best with fasting bread. The rivalry's greatest gift was this duality, a comfort with contradiction that let the region embrace progress without forsaking tradition, ambition without abandoning community. Even the architecture tells the story. The winemaker's descendants built grand chateaux, but their gardens still feature secluded prayer niches. The monastery's walls now house a wine museum, its cellars displaying both sacramental chalices and the original ledgers tracking the abbot's tithes. What began as a battle for control ended as a partnership of necessity, then finally, a shared identity. The proof is in the soil itself, where vine roots twine around ancient monastery foundations, each supporting the other in a quiet embrace no one could have predicted centuries ago. Centuries may have passed, but the fingerprints of this rivalry still press into the present like vines etching their roots into old stone. Take the annual feast of St. Vincent, where monks in medieval robes bless the first grapes alongside vineyard owners in designer sunglasses, a ritual that would have baffled both the abbot and the winemaker, yet feels as natural as the changing seasons. The procession winds through streets hung with banners depicting both crosses and grape clusters, while children scramble for candy tossed from floats shaped like wine barrels and reliquaries. It's not just tradition, it's theater, a living reenactment of that ancient tension between chapel and cellar, now performed with a wink and a toast. Even the landscape bears witness. Drive through the region today, and you'll spot monasteries with gift shops selling award-winning vintages made from their own resurrected vineyards. Vineyards that, records suggest, were once the very plots the abbot and winemaker fought over. The monks now employ oenologists, while the secular winemakers fund scholarships at the abbey's historical archive, ensuring those medieval land disputes stay neatly catalogued rather than reignited. What was once a battleground has become a carefully curated collaboration, though the old undercurrents remain. Order the monk's reserve at a local bistro, and the waiter might lean in conspiratorially. The cellar master here is the abbot's great-nephew, but the grapes, those come from the winemaker's original estate. The rivalry's most tangible legacy is in the glasses raised daily across the region. Modern vintners still use techniques the winemaker pioneered, staking vines on disputed hillsides for optimal sun exposure, aging barrels in limestone caves the monks once claimed for storing relics. But they've also embraced the Abbot's innovations, like the yeast strains cultivated in monastery labs for sacramental wine, now prized for their ability to ferment under cool cellar temperatures. The result is a signature style that balances bold fruit with earthy restraint, a liquid metaphor for the region's hard-won equilibrium. Even the tourism trade thrives on this duality. Visitors can sip champagne at a sleek winery built over the winemaker's original press house, then stroll to the abbey for vespers in a chapel where stained glass windows depict not saints, but vineyard workers tending the harvest. The gift shop does brisk business in bottles labeled with both the abbey's seal and the winemaker's family crest, a pairing that would have been unthinkable centuries ago. Guides spin the rivalry as a charming local legend, though sometimes, after a few tastings, an older winemaker might murmur how certain vineyard boundaries still follow the exact lines drawn in those long-ago legal battles. Perhaps the most telling modern echo is in the region's identity. Ask a sommelier about their terroir, and they'll wax poetic about the soil's mineral richness. But ask a grandmother why the local wine tastes like home, and she'll shrug. Because our ancestors fought like devils over these hills, then learned to share them. The abbot and the winemaker never truly won or lost. They simply wore each other down into something resembling harmony. Today, their story isn't taught in schools as history. It's lived, poured into glasses at weddings and funerals alike. A reminder that even the bitterest conflicts can, with time, mellow into something worth celebrating. Power isn't always seized with a sword sometimes. It's pressed from grapes and whispered in prayers. The rivalry between the winemaker and the abbot offers a masterclass in influence, revealing how control is rarely taken outright but negotiated through persistence, creativity, and the occasional well-placed barrel of wine. Think of modern corporate titans vying for market share, or politicians maneuvering through bureaucratic mazes. The playbook hasn't changed as much as we might think. Both men understood that real power isn't about dominance. It's about shaping the rules of the game so subtly that opponents don't realize they're playing by your terms until it's too late. Consider the winemaker's approach. He couldn't challenge the church directly, so he weaponized generosity. Feasts, roads, even a chapel, each act of charity eroded the abbey's monopoly on community goodwill. Today's equivalent, tech giants funding schools in neighborhoods where they're lobbying for tax breaks, or celebrities using social advocacy to shift public opinion. The abbot, meanwhile, wielded institutional authority like a scalpel, leveraging traditions no one dared question. It's the same play we see when legacy industries lobby for regulations that stifle disruptors, or when political parties frame their agendas as moral imperatives rather than policy choices. Both strategies reveal a universal truth: power thrives in the gaps between what's said and what's understood. The most striking parallel lies in their use of soft power. The winemakers' festivals weren't just parties, they were loyalty programs, creating emotional ties stronger than any contract. The abbot's control of the liturgical calendar ensured villagers' rhythms aligned with the church's interests. Modern parallels abound, companies cultivating brand devotion through curated experiences, or governments framing national identity around shared rituals. Even their conflicts followed a pattern familiar in boardrooms today, escalating through proxies, like when the winemaker's rumors targeted the abbey's cellar master rather than the abbot himself, much like corporations attacking competitors' suppliers in trade wars. Yet their story also warns against overreach. The winemaker's near monopoly on local trade could have sparked rebellion if not tempered by his public generosity. The abbot's heavy tithes risked driving villagers into the winemaker's arms. Their eventual détente mirrors modern antitrust compromises or political coalitions, reminding us that unchecked ambition often sows the seeds of its own downfall. The brilliance of their rivalry wasn't in its fireworks but in its restraint. Neither could afford to destroy the other because their fates were entwined like vines around a trellis. What makes their struggle so instructive is its ambiguity. There were no outright winners, only a hard-won balance that let both thrive. In an era of zero-sum thinking, their story whispers a counterintuitive lesson. Sometimes, the most enduring power comes not from crushing rivals, but from letting them live just enough to keep you sharp. The winemaker's barrels and the abbot's blessings didn't just shape a village, they crafted a blueprint for influence that still resonates wherever ambition meets tradition, and where the art of the possible is negotiated one subtle move at a time. Archaeology rarely uncovers grand declarations of war. More often, it's the quiet debris of daily life that betrays history's fiercest rivalries. In the cellars beneath the winemaker's estate, researchers found a ledger unlike any other. Its pages weren't just records of harvests and sales. They were coded with tiny grapevine doodles next to certain names, marking which merchants had broken contracts with the abbey to deal exclusively with him. A few miles away, beneath the monastery's granary, excavators unearthed something even more telling. A hidden compartment stacked with empty wine barrels, each stamped with the winemaker's crest but carefully scraped clean. The abbot's monks had clearly been drinking the rival's vintage while publicly condemning it. Then there were the tunnels. What began as a survey of the village's medieval drainage system revealed a narrow passage running from the winemaker's property straight toward the abbey's outer wall, not for smuggling but for eavesdropping. Charred fragments of wax near the tunnel's end suggest someone once crouched there, holding a candle to melt sealing wax and peek at monastery correspondence. Even the land itself bears scars of their struggle. Ground-penetrating radar showed vineyard rows abruptly changing direction near contested boundaries, as if the winemaker had replanted overnight to claim a few extra feet of soil. But the most poignant find was a broken wine press discovered halfway between the two estates. Its wooden beams were splintered as if struck with deliberate force, and wedged beneath it, a single silver coin minted with the abbot's likeness. Was it sabotage, a hidden payment, or perhaps a worker's quiet act of defiance torn between two masters? These artifacts don't just fill gaps in the historical record. They whisper secrets the chroniclers never dared write down. Perhaps the clearest evidence of their rivalry's scale lies in the village's very layout. Modern laser surveys reveal property lines zigzagging like battlefronts, with homes and shops clustered in odd concentrations, not for practicality, but because families literally built their houses on neutral ground, wary of siding too openly with either faction. Even the soil tells a story. Core samples from contested vineyards show layers of ash and grape seeds, proof of generations of burned crops and hasty replanting. Yet for all the conflict these objects reveal, they also hint at something deeper: mutual dependence. The winemaker's ledgers list payments to the abbey's stonemasons. The monastery's kitchen accounts include purchases from his vineyards. Like grapevines and olive trees planted side by side, their roots were too entangled to ever fully sever. The archaeology of this rivalry isn't just a record of strife, it's a testament to how even the bitterest opponents can shape each other's legacies in ways neither could have imagined. The parchment tells one story, but the wine stains on its edges whisper another. Among the monastery's meticulously kept chronicles, the abbot's scribes recorded the rivalry with careful omissions, pages that mention unseasonable frosts damaging vines, but never the rumors of monks ringing bells to delay harvests, or entries praising the winemaker's generous donations without noting they were tithes paid under duress. These weren't lies so much as curated truths, framed to uphold the abbey's image of divine authority. Yet between the lines, frustration bleeds through. A scribe's unusually sharp quark strokes when describing the winemaker's feasts, or a margin note comparing vineyard workers to locusts stripped of grapes before tithes could be collected. The winemaker's own records survive in fragments, water-damaged ledgers and contracts where the real story hides in the gaps. A line item for gifts to the Duke's steward appears alongside a suspiciously low harvest tally that year, hinting at bribes to avoid tithes. His letters to merchants preserved in distant archives boast of vintages so fine even the Abbot's cellarmaster begs for a taste, a jab disguised as salesmanship. But the most revealing document might be his household accounts, payments to a scribe who just happened to be the Abbot's disgraced nephew, suggesting some secrets flowed both ways. Tax rolls exposed the economic battlefield. The winemakers declared yields mysteriously shrank whenever the abbey's assessors visited, then swelled in records sent to royal tax collectors, a shell game of numbers. Meanwhile, the monastery's accounts list lost barrels of sacramental wine that somehow ended up in the winemaker's trading partners' hands, likely traded for favors. Even the village's birth registers hold clues. A spike in babies named Vincent, patron saint of vintners, after a particularly contentious harvest, followed by a wave of Benedicts, the abbot's namesake, when the church tightened its grip. The real goldmine, though, lies in the personal letters neither meant for posterity. A monk's anguished note to his brother complains of being ordered to bless that upstart's casks while he mocks us with his gilded gates. The winemaker's wife's correspondence frets over her husband's black moods after the abbot blocked a key land sale. These unguarded moments reveal the human cost of their chess game, the sleepless nights, the clenched jaws behind public smiles. What's chilling is how much isn't recorded. No parchment mentions the fire that destroyed the winemaker's storage shed in 1287, though charred timbers still lie buried there. The abbey's chronicles skip the year its cellar-master vanished, returning weeks later with a sudden knowledge of oak barrel aging. These silences scream louder than any decree. Because in the end, the rivalry wasn't fought in proclamations, but in the spaces between words, where a dropped pen, an altered number, or a conveniently faded ink could shift fortunes as surely as a sword. The greatest lesson of these records isn't what they say, but what they demand we imagine, the hands that wrote them, the eyes that read them, and the truths they chose to bury like vines pruning themselves for a stronger harvest. History has a way of polishing rough edges until legends gleam like stained glass, casting heroes and villains in light that never quite existed at the time. The winemaker of our story has been painted as a folk hero, a defiant uprooter of church authority, his barrels rolling like cannons against the fortress of tradition. The abbot, in turn, often shrinks into caricature, a scowling figure clutching his tithe ledger like a miser's purse. But peel back the layers of myth, and you'll find two men who are neither saints nor demons, but products of their world, flawed, pragmatic, and shaped by forces larger than themselves. Take the winemaker's so-called rebellion. Was he really battling for the common villager's freedom, or simply protecting his own hard-won privileges? His ledgers tell a nuanced tale. While he did lower prices for struggling families, those same families then owed him labor during harvest, a debt that could bind them as tightly as any tithe. His famed generosity with festivals and roads wasn't pure altruism. It was calculated patronage, the medieval equivalent of a modern corporation funding a town's little league team. Even his defiance of the abbey had limits. Records show he still paid token tithes on his least profitable vineyards, a careful dance between resistance and self-preservation. The abbot, too, defies easy labels. Yes, he wielded spiritual authority like a cudgel, but his monastery's archives reveal a man trapped in a system he didn't create. Those heavy tithes, many funded the orphanage and hospital his monks operated. When he blocked the winemaker's land grabs, it wasn't always greed. Sometimes it was to preserve fields where villagers grazed livestock, a safety net against famine. Even his infamous control of the harvest calendar had practical roots. Delaying picking until after the feast of St. Michael ensured migrant workers could attend Mass before laboring, a small mercy in an unforgiving world. What's most fascinating is how their reputations calcified over time. The winemaker's descendants proudly displayed his original contracts as emblems of entrepreneurial spirit, while quietly omitting the clauses where he charged interest on grain loans. The abbey's chroniclers, meanwhile, glossed over the fact that their holy vineyard boundaries were often just old property lines drawn by long-dead nobles. Both men became symbols, avatars for larger cultural battles about tradition versus progress, until the messy reality of their choices faded into folklore. The truth lies not in extremes but in the quiet spaces between. The winemaker wasn't a revolutionary. He was a brilliant opportunist navigating a changing world. The abbot wasn't a tyrant. He was an institutionalist trying to preserve order as the ground shifted beneath his feet. Their conflict mattered precisely because it was so ordinary. Two capable men, each convinced their vision was right, neither wholly good nor evil. That's why their story endures, not as a fable of clear-cut heroes, but as a mirror reflecting how ambition and duty, innovation and tradition have always tangled in the messy soil of human progress. Weather didn't just shape the vineyards, it wielded power like a silent third rival in this centuries-long struggle. A single season of drought could crack the earth beneath the winemaker's vines, leaving grapes shriveled and barrels empty, while unrelenting rains might drown the monastery's grain stores, turning precious tithes to mold. These weren't mere setbacks, they were catalysts that exposed the fragile balance between the two men's ambitions. When the skies withheld rain, the winemaker's workers would whisper that the abbot's prayers had failed, or worse, that he deliberately cursed the clouds to weaken his rival's trade. Conversely, a sudden frost after the abbot delayed the harvest blessing could spark rumors that the winemaker had bribed the bell ringer to sabotage the monks' orchards. The true genius of their conflict lay in how each man weaponized the weather. During a brutal drought in 1294, the winemaker diverted a shared irrigation channel to save his youngest vines, leaving the monastery's herb gardens parched. The abbot retaliated by declaring an impromptu day of fasting and prayer for rain, a move that conveniently dried up wine sales at the market. Even hailstorms became strategic opportunities. The winemaker's ledgers show payments to itinerant roofers right after a devastating hailstorm, not to repair his own estate, but to fix the homes of key workers before the abbot could offer shelter in exchange for pledged labor. But climate's cruelest trick was its unpredictability. A perfect growing season could be just as destabilizing as a disaster. When an unusually warm autumn in 1301 yielded a record harvest, the winemaker's warehouses overflowed only for the abbot to impose an extra Thanksgiving tithe on the bounty, framing it as divine repayment for the blessing of good weather. The winemaker responded by flooding the market with cheap wine, undermining the monastery's ability to sell its own reserves. The resulting price crash hurt both sides, proving that even nature's generosity could become a weapon when wielded with enough spite. Long-term shifts in the climate played their part too. The gradual cooling of the Little Ice Age forced the winemaker to experiment with hardier grape varieties, some grown from cuttings the abbot's own monks had cultivated for sacramental wine. This uneasy collaboration, born of necessity, revealed the irony at the heart of their feud. They needed each other's knowledge to survive the changing world, even as they fought tooth and nail for dominance. The land itself seemed to mock their rivalry, offering just enough bounty to keep both men in the game, but never enough for either to land a decisive blow. In the end, weather exposed the limits of human control. A flood might wash away a season's work, but it also forced the winemaker and abbot to share boats when rescuing stored grain from the village cellars. A killing frost could devastate the vineyards, yet it was the abbot who quietly lent the winemaker seed stock from the monastery's greenhouse when his own reserves failed. These moments of reluctant cooperation, born from shared vulnerability to the whims of wind and rain, hinted at the deeper truth. For all their schemes, both men were ultimately subjects to forces far older and wilder than their carefully constructed empires of faith and fermentation. The cobblestones of the village square bore the grooves of countless wooden clogs, each scratch a silent testament to the workers who turned grand rivalries into tangible reality. While the winemaker and abbot plotted in ledgers and sermons, it was the calloused hands of peasants that pruned the vines, hauled the tithe carts, and whispered truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Their loyalty wasn't given freely. It was negotiated daily in stolen sips of wine at harvest, in the way a basket of grapes might mysteriously lighten before reaching the monastery's scales, or how a barrel marked for blessing sometimes emerged from the cellar suspiciously half full. Take the Cooper's Guild, men who shaped the very barrels that carried both sacramental wine and the winemaker's finest vintages. Their secret, crafting casks for the abbot with slightly tighter staves to slow evaporation, while the winemaker's barrels breathed just enough to mellow his harshest presses. A tiny rebellion, unnoticed by lords and clerics, but one that quietly shaped the taste and value of both men's fortunes. Or consider the midwives and herbalists who moved between cottage and cloister, blending monastery-blessed remedies with vineyard-grown tonics, creating a hybrid healing tradition that answered to neither master but served everyone. Even the children played their part. A game called Saint and Sinner swept the village boys pretending to be the abbot collecting tithes, while others played smugglers hiding grapes in their hats. The winemaker's foreman chuckled until they noticed the kids had mapped every hidden path through the orchards, paths that later proved useful for avoiding the abbot's tax assessors. Meanwhile, old women telling folktales by the fire wove subtle lessons, stories of foxes who outsmarted wolves by playing them against each other, or saints who rewarded those who shared bread before prayer. The true power of these ordinary villagers lay in their collective silence. When the abbot demanded extra labor during vintage season, whole families might suddenly fall ill only to be seen working the winemaker's fields days later. When the winemaker's prices rose too high, anonymous hands would slash his storage nets, sending precious grapes tumbling into the dirt where neighbors could salvage them. These weren't acts of chaos but calibrated resistance, a way to remind both factions that grapes didn't crush themselves and tithes didn't magically appear. Some risks were bolder. The miller's daughter, apprenticed to the monastery's scribe, deliberately smudged ink on documents listing vineyard boundaries. The blacksmith forged tools with subtle flaws for the abbot's orchard keeper's blades that snapped just when pruning cuts needed to be precise. Even the drunken baker who burned the monastery's bread every Easter might have been less clumsy than he seemed. His cousin tended the winemaker's ovens. What's striking is how these small acts accumulated into real leverage. The abbot's records fret over unaccountable shortages, while the winemaker's ledgers grumble about lazy laborers. Yet both men knew the truth. The village was no chessboard, and its people weren't pawns. They were the living, breathing ecosystem that made the rivalry possible, and their quiet agency ensured neither side could ever fully dominate. After all, a vineyard without skilled pickers is just a bramble patch. A monastery without devoted hands is merely cold stone. In the end, the forgotten voices left their mark not through grand decrees, but through the stubborn persistence of everyday choices. The extra hours stolen for a family meal during harvest, the lost donkey that delayed a tithe payment, the folk songs that praised the winemaker's generosity in one verse and the abbot's mercy in the next. Their legacy wasn't written in ink, but in the way the village learned to navigate the storm between two towering oaks by bending like grass, rooted, resilient, and always growing toward the light. The story of the winemaker and the abbot is more than a historical curiosity. It's a mirror reflecting the eternal dance of power, innovation, and tradition. Their silent rivalry shaped a region's identity, blending faith and commerce into a unique cultural tapestry. As we raise a glass today, let's remember the unseen battles that made such moments possible. What makes their story so enduring isn't just the clash of personalities or the clever maneuvers, it's the way their struggle reveals a universal truth. Progress and tradition aren't opposites, but partners in a delicate balancing act. The winemaker's relentless drive for excellence pushed the abbot to adapt, while the abbot's unwavering authority forced the winemaker to innovate. Like vines and trellises, they needed each other to grow, even as they competed for sunlight. Consider how their legacy lives on in the smallest details. The way a sommelier today might describe a wine as monastic in style, nodding to those ancient cellar techniques, or how local festivals still blend grape stomping with solemn processions, a living homage to the duality they embodied. Even the region's architecture tells the tale: vineyard estates with chapel-like tasting rooms, monasteries with bustling market stalls. Their rivalry didn't just leave scars, it planted seeds. But perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in what they couldn't control. No ledger could predict a drought, no prayer could halt a hailstorm. Their greatest adversary wasn't each other. It was the humbling reality that nature, time, and human resilience would always have the final word. The winemaker's barrels and the abbot's blessings were just fleeting attempts to impose order on a world that thrives on change. As the last light fades on these cobbled streets and vineyard rows, their story lingers like the aftertaste of a fine vintage complex, surprising, impossible to forget. It reminds us that history isn't made by grand declarations alone, but in the quiet spaces between harvests and holy days, where ordinary people navigate the tides of power with grit and grace. If you've enjoyed this journey into medieval intrigue, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What other hidden rivalries would you like us to explore next? The past is full of untold stories waiting to be uncorked, each one a reminder that the most fascinating battles are often fought without a single sword drawn. Until next time, may your wine be rich, your history richer, and your curiosity never run dry.